Have you ever experienced something for the first time, but did he have the strange feeling that this had happened before? Not as a vague memory nor as imagination, but as absolute certainty. It's almost unsettling, as if that moment was already stored somewhere in your mind. If this has ever happened to you, stick with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. Imagine the scene. You enter a new place, talk to someone you just met, or hear a simple phrase. Nothing extraordinary. And yet, something inside you freezes. A subtle, yet intense, feeling of familiarity. It's not exactly classic déjà vu. It's different. It's as if your brain decided, without warning you, that the present has already become the past. Have you ever experienced this? The most unsettling thing is that this feeling isn't accompanied by confusion. On the contrary, it comes with conviction. With the impression that you're remembering, and not just feeling. And the more you try to rationalize it, the harder it becomes to explain. Because deep down it seems too real to be a mistake, and too strange to be just a coincidence. We tend to believe that the brain records reality like a camera. What happens now becomes a memory later. But what if that's not exactly how it works? What if, at certain moments, the brain anticipate this process? Why treat the present as something that has already been lived? This question is unsettling because it touches on something essential. Our notion of time, of consciousness, of reality. Perhaps you've never stopped to think about it, but the brain doesn't just live in the present moment. It's constantly comparing, predicting, adjusting. It tries to understand what's happening even before you realize it. And in this process, small glitches can occur. Glitches that are almost invisible, but powerful enough to create the feeling that the present has arrived, late. And here's the most disturbing detail. When the brain registers the present as if it were the past, it doesn't warn you that this is happening. No alert appears. There is no system error. What exists is only the sensation. The strange familiarity. The impression that you've already been there, heard this, lived that, even knowing rationally that you haven't. What makes it all the more intriguing is that these experiences often arise in ordinary, everyday moments. They don't require extreme situations. Sometimes they happen when you're distracted, tired, or lost in thought. Other times they appear out of nowhere. And that's exactly what makes so many people wonder, is this normal? Is it just a curiosity of the brain, or a sign of something deeper happening behind the scenes of the mind? As you listen to this, you might be remembering a specific situation. You might be thinking, this has happened to me before, but I never knew how to explain it. And that's where the power of this phenomenon lies. It's not rare. It's not unique. But almost no one talks about it with enough depth to go beyond the superficial label. The goal here is not to offer easy answers. It's to look at these subtle flaws of the mind with curiosity, respect, and a certain healthy discomfort. In the way that dark human essence, he believes that the mysteries of the brain should be explored, without haste, without simplifications, without comforting illusions. Because when the brain confuses time, it reveals something much bigger about how we perceive reality. And perhaps, by understanding why the present sometimes seems like a memory, we will begin to see that the now is never as simple as it seems. Take a deep breath, because from here on out, we're going to enter exactly that point where the brain begins to blur the lines between what is happening and what it believes it has already experienced. And perhaps the most curious thing of all is realizing that when these feelings arise, we almost always keep them silent. We feel them, find them strange, and move on. As if talking about it were an exaggeration. As if it weren't real enough. But it is real, at least for those who have lived it. And if this topic is affecting you now, if some specific memory surfaced while you were listening to this, don't ignore it. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below describing what touched you the most. You don't need to explain it perfectly or use fancy words. Sometimes just saying, "I felt this before," creates a powerful connection. Because when someone comments, another person reads it and thinks, so it wasn't just me. That's how this type of conversation starts to gain depth. And if at any point during this video you felt that inner chill, that strange sense of recognition, of curiosity mixed with unease, it's worth giving it a like. Not as an automatic gesture, but as a sign that this content truly resonated with you. This helps more than it seems. It helps the video reach people who may also be trying to understand similar experiences, but haven't yet found the words for it. Now, if you feel that this type of reflection captivates you, provokes you, makes you look at the human brain with more attention and fewer ready-made answers, consider subscribing to the channel. Not as an empty promise of more videos, but as a silent invitation to continue exploring these strange limits of the mind together. Subscribing is a way of saying, I want to continue this journey. Your participation here is what makes this space grow and reach more people with this type of content. Every comment, Every like, every subscription creates a small chain reaction. And when the subject is something as delicate as how we perceive time, memory, and the present, this exchange makes all the difference. So, as we move forward, as we begin to delve a little deeper into that exact point where the brain decides what is present and what has already become a memory, keep this in mind. What you feel, think, and share here is not a detail. It is a living part of this conversation. And from here, things get even more interesting. When we say that the brain, at times, treats the present as if it were a memory, we're not using a poetic metaphor. We're describing a real, documented phenomenon experienced by millions of people, and yet poorly understood outside the realm of neuroscience. It's strange because it doesn't seem like a gross error. It seems too refined to be just a flaw. It almost seems like a hidden truth about how the mind organizes human experience. The present moment, theoretically, should be the most solid point of our perception. It's where everything happens. It's where we make decisions, react, and feel. But the brain doesn't perceive time as we learned in school in a straight line, the past behind us, the future ahead. For it, time is a functional construct, a tool. It mixes records, predictions, and memories all the time, adjusting everything in real time to maintain the sensation of continuity. And it's precisely in this fine-tuning that something curious can happen. At certain times, the brain recognizes patterns too quickly. So quickly that, even before you consciously realize what's happening, it has already compared that stimulus to previous experiences, similar contexts, and similar emotions. When this comparison is triggered strongly enough, the sensation that arises is not one of novelty but of familiarity. Not because you've experienced it before but because the brain, he decided to treat it as if he had already lived through it. This is where many people confuse this phenomenon with classic déjà vu. They are similar but they are not the same thing. Déjà vu usually comes as a flash, a brief shock, almost a perceptual short circuit. When the brain registers the present as past, the sensation can be more subtle, more prolonged, more integrated into the experience. It's not just, this has already happened. It's, this is already part of me. As if that moment had been pulled from an internal drawer, even though it's happening now. The impact of this on perception is profound. Because if the present can be felt as a memory, then our confidence in our own experience begins to waver. And not dramatically but silently. You start to wonder if what you feel is a reaction or a memory, if you are living or remembering. This ambiguity messes with your mindset, with how we give meaning to even the simplest events. There's an important detail here. The brain does this to function better, not worse. It's not trying to confuse you. It's trying to be efficient. At every moment, it needs to predict what comes next, calculate risks, anticipate responses. To do this, it relies on past experiences. The problem arises when this mechanism spins too fast, when prediction gets mixed up with recording, when the present slips into the archive before its time. And this happens more often than we imagine in specific states of mind. Moments of deep distraction when we are absorbed in thought. States of mental fatigue when the brain seeks shortcuts. Emotionally neutral situations where nothing draws enough attention to mark the present as something unique. Under these conditions, the brain goes into automatic mode, and the automatic lives on old patterns. The curious thing is that, even though it's an internal phenomenon, the sensation it provokes is extremely convincing. The brain activates regions linked to emotional memory, which gives weight, density, and texture to the experience. It doesn't seem invented. It seems remembered. And this generates an interesting psychological effect. We tend to trust more in what seems like memory than in what seems new. Memories give a sense of security. They create the illusion of control. Therefore, when the present seems like a memory, it also seems more predictable, more familiar, less threatening. This influences decisions, reactions, and even how we evaluate people and situations. A new environment may seem comfortable for no apparent reason. A new conversation may sound familiar. A path never traveled may seem obvious. The brain, by recycling the present as the past, silently shapes our journey. This phenomenon also raises an uncomfortable question. How many of our certainties come from real experiences, and how many come only from the way the brain has decided to label the moment? How many times have we felt that we knew something, when in reality we only recognized an incomplete pattern? How many personal truths are born from this invisible mechanism? Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding why the brain does this requires looking at how it constructs meaning. Not just intellectual meaning but emotional meaning. The brain doesn't register raw facts. It registers relevance. It decides what matters and what can be reused later. And sometimes in this process, it anticipates the archiving of the present, as if preparing the ground for the future. This anticipation is not conscious. It happens behind the scenes, beyond the reach of our attention. When we realize it, the effect is already there. The feeling of already experienced. The calm strangeness. The familiarity without origin. It is at this point that many people begin to question their own perception, when in reality they are merely witnessing the raw workings of the human mind. And perhaps the most fascinating thing is realizing that this phenomenon reveals something greater about who we are. It reveals that our experience of time is not objective. That the present is not a fixed point but a flexible construct. That memory doesn't live only in the past. It invades the present, shapes decisions, influences emotions, alters trajectories. As you listen to this, it's possible that some specific situation is rearranging itself in your mind. A simple, forgotten moment that now takes on a new layer of meaning. And that's part of the process. When we understand the mechanisms behind these sensations, we begin to see the mind not as a precise machine, but as a living, adaptive system, full of fine adjustments and small functional flaws. And there's more to it than that. Because if the brain is capable of transforming the present into memory, that says a lot about how it deals with the future, with uncertainty, with the unknown. But before entering that territory, it's worth anchoring this reflection in something simple, almost intimate. Recognizing that this experience doesn't isolate you. It connects you to something profoundly human. So, if all of this resonated with you, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. When we call this a silent brain error, it's not to diminish the phenomenon, nor to treat it as something trivial. On the contrary. It's silent precisely because it happens without noise, without warning, without clear symptoms. There's nothing supernatural here, but there's also nothing simple about it. The brain doesn't function as a faithful recorder of reality. It functions as an editor. It chooses, cuts, reorganizes, gives meaning. And in this process, sometimes it assembles the sequence, out of order. There's a comfortable idea that we live in the present, then remember it. But behind the scenes, the logic is different. The brain is always interpreting before registering. It assesses relevance, emotion, context, future usefulness. Only after that does it decide how that moment will be stored. And in specific situations, this archiving happens too quickly. So quickly that the present is treated as something that has already passed, even while it is still happening. This isn't a gross error. It's a consequence of a highly efficient system trying to handle an absurd volume of information. Every second, thousands of stimuli compete for attention. The brain can't record everything in real time in its entirety. So it simplifies. It creates shortcuts. It groups similar experiences. It anticipates conclusions. And in doing so, it can end up putting the wrong label on the present moment. When this happens, the feeling isn't one of confusion, but of familiarity. Because the brain doesn't signal error. It signals recognition. It says, this is already cataloged. And this message arrives as a feeling, not as a rational thought. That's why it's so difficult to explain. You feel it before you understand it. And often you misunderstand it because you trust your feelings too much. This mechanism has a profound impact on how we perceive reality. Because if the brain can treat the present moment as memory, then our experience of time is more flexible than we imagine. The present ceases to be a solid point and becomes a transition zone. A gray area where perception, memory, and prediction blend together. This silent error becomes more likely when the brain enters economy mode. States of mental fatigue, overstimulation, repetitive routines, constant multitasking. Under these conditions, the brain prioritizes speed over accuracy. It prefers to decide quickly rather than correctly. And this shapes our mindset without us even realizing it. This is where automatic decisions come in. The feeling of, I already know how this ends, even without evidence. The impression that something is familiar and therefore reliable. Or the opposite. The immediate rejection of something new because the brain associates it with a past experience that is not always equivalent. This error in registration is not limited to memory. It spreads to judgments, choices, and attitudes. How many times have you made a decision based on a vague feeling of recognition? How many times have you trusted or distrusted someone without knowing exactly why? In many cases, it wasn't mystical intuition. It was the brain reusing old files to interpret a present situation that it didn't have the time, or energy, to carefully analyze. This reuse creates a coherent but not always true internal narrative. The brain hates gaps. It prefers an imperfect explanation to no explanation at all. So it fills them in. It connects the dots. It creates continuity. And this continuity is comfortable. It gives a feeling of control, of understanding, of mastering the situation. Even when it's just a well-constructed illusion. There's a hidden truth here. Much of what we call conscious experience is already edited. It's already organized. It already has embedded meaning. The brain's silent error doesn't create chaos. It creates a story. A story that seems logical, fluid, consistent. But that story may be based on a disordered record. And this has a direct impact on our personal journey. Because if the present is interpreted based on poorly positioned memories, transformation becomes more difficult. We react to the now as if we were reacting to yesterday. We repeat patterns thinking we are being rational. We confuse familiarity with truth. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding why the brain does this requires looking at the relationship between memory and survival. The brain wasn't made to seek absolute truth. It was made to reduce risks, to anticipate threats, to maintain the integrity of the system. And, in that sense, treating the present as the past can be a strategy. A way of saying, I've seen this before, I know how to deal with it. The problem is that the world changes faster than our internal files. Contexts transform. People are not the same. Similar situations are not identical. But the brain works by similarity, not by absolute precision. It approximates what seems similar even when the differences matter. This dynamic explains why certain experiences seem out of place in time. Why sometimes you feel like you're reliving something when in reality you're just facing something new with old tools. The brain anticipates meaning before analyzing the fact. It constructs meaning before checking reality. This error is not an isolated defect. It is part of a complex adaptive system. A system that works well most of the time, but which exacts its price in the form of subtle distortions. Distortions that we rarely notice but which profoundly shape our worldview. When we start to see this, something changes. We begin to distrust immediate certainties a little more. To question automatic sensations. To realize that not everything that seems like a memory is a recollection, and not everything that seems like intuition is wisdom. Sometimes it's just the brain trying to buy time. And this perception opens up space for something important: conscious choice. When you understand that the brain can register the present out of order, you gain the chance to pause, to observe, to ask yourself if that feeling comes from the present moment or from an old file being reused. This doesn't eliminate the error, but it lessens the impact. Because ultimately, understanding this silent error is understanding something essential about the human mind. We are not neutral observers of reality. We are interpreters, editors, internal narrators. And what we call now passes through invisible filters before reaching consciousness. As all of this falls into place, you might begin to realize that this subtle flaw isn't just scientific curiosity. It's a key to understanding behaviors, beliefs, emotional reactions, and even personal blocks. But before venturing into that territory, let this reflection resonate for a moment. If this resonated with you, leave a comment below. I'm on this journey too. There's a delicate and fascinating point where presence, memory, and prediction cease to be separate things and begin to function as a single mechanism. We tend to imagine that the brain is constantly reacting to what happens, but that's not true. Most of the time, it is anticipating. He lives a few milliseconds ahead of reality, trying to guess the next sound, the next gesture, the next word. And he does this by comparing the present with old patterns that are already stored. The brain doesn't wait for the world to reveal itself before understanding it. It tries to understand it beforehand. It predicts, tests, adjusts. Every fraction of a second is a silent bet on what comes next. This constant prediction is what gives fluidity to experience. It's what makes the world seem continuous, coherent, stable. Without it, everything would be delay, surprise, noise. But this efficiency has an invisible cost. When the brain compares the present with the past, it doesn't perform a detailed analysis. It looks for enough similarity to make a quick decision. And often, enough doesn't mean exact. It simply means similar enough. When this comparison happens too quickly, the brain can reach a hasty conclusion. This is already known, and this conclusion doesn't come in the form of a sentence. It comes in the form of a feeling. It is at this moment that the present begins to behave like a memory. Not because you remembered something specific, but because the brain activated the same circuit it usually activates when it recognizes something familiar. The internal timeline folds. The now loses its novelty and gains the weight of something already experienced. And that changes everything. This mix of prediction and recollection happens all the time, but it usually goes unnoticed. We only notice it when the effect is too intense. When the feeling of familiarity doesn't match the context. When something too new seems strangely old. That's when the discomfort arises. The silent question. The shattering of expectations. At this point, the brain isn't trying to deceive you. It's trying to keep the narrative going. It prefers to assume it already knows something rather than admit uncertainty. Uncertainty demands energy. It demands attention. It demands recalculating routes. So, when possible, the brain recycles. It reuses old models to deal with new situations. This is a powerful survival strategy, but also a constant source of distortions. This dynamic directly affects our mindset, because we start living new experiences with old filters, reacting to present situations with inherited emotions, making decisions based on predictions that seem certain, but are just quick comparisons. How many choices have you made guided by a feeling of this will work out, or this will go wrong, without knowing exactly why? Most of the time, this feeling arises from that invisible intersection between memory and prediction. The brain recognizes an incomplete pattern and fills in the rest of the story. It creates an expectation and, at the same time, a false memory of something that hasn't even happened yet. The present becomes an anticipated confirmation of something the brain believes it already knows. This has a profound impact on everyone's personal journey, because the way we interpret the present moment shapes the path we follow. If the present seems familiar, we tend to relax. If it seems threatening, we tend to shut down. But these reactions don't always correspond to the reality of the moment. They correspond to the internal story the brain tells itself in milliseconds. There's a hidden truth in all of this. Our perception of time is constructed, not lived in its pure form. The brain creates a continuous experience by mixing past and future within the present. The present, as we feel it, already comes loaded with expectations and memories. And when this mixture becomes unbalanced, strange phenomena arise, such as the feeling that we are remembering what is still happening. This imbalance becomes more evident in specific states. When we are too emotionally neutral, the brain doesn't find strong markers of novelty. When we are overwhelmed, it accelerates comparisons. When we are on autopilot, it relies too much on old patterns. At these times, the present easily slips into the realm of memory. And the most intriguing thing is that this is rarely perceived as a mistake. Because the experience continues to flow. Nothing breaks. Reality doesn't fail. It just takes on a strange hue, a feeling displaced in time. And since it doesn't hurt, doesn't frighten, and doesn't paralyze, most people simply accept it and move on without questioning. But when we begin to observe this mechanism, something changes. The experience of the present moment gains another layer. We realize that not all familiarity is a sign of prior experience. That not all emotional certainty corresponds to a fact. That many of our reactions are predictions disguised as memories. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding this mix between present, memory, and prediction reveals something essential about how the brain deals with the future. It doesn't wait for the future to arrive. It rehearses it. It simulates it. It tests it within the present moment. And sometimes, this rehearsal is so convincing that it becomes confused with memory. This confusion is not an isolated flaw. It is a byproduct of a system that needs to make quick decisions in a complex world. A system that prefers continuity to absolute precision. A system that constructs meaning before constructing truth. And this explains why so many human experiences seem laden with meaning even when we cannot explain their origin. When the brain concludes this is already known, it is not stating a historical fact. It is making a functional decision. It is saying, I can handle this using what I already have. And this decision shapes emotions, behaviors, and future choices, even if it is based on an incomplete understanding of the present. As this idea settles in, you might realize that many situations in your life have taken on a different interpretation. Moments when you felt immediate comfort for no clear reason. Or unjustified discomfort. Or the strange feeling of repeating something that seemed new. All of this is part of that invisible mechanism that mixes times within consciousness. And there are even deeper layers to this, because this ability to predict and recognize defines not only how we live in the present, but how we transform over time. But before moving forward on this path, it's worth letting this perception mature a little. If this thought resonated with you, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. There is a decisive factor that runs through all of this and that almost never receives the attention it deserves. Attention itself. Or rather, the lack thereof. Because the brain does not register the present moment in the same way in all mental states. It registers it according to the quality of attention available at that moment. And when that attention is fragmented, tired, or scattered, the registration of the present moment is incomplete. When we are exhausted, anxious, or simply operating on autopilot, the brain enters maximum economy mode. It doesn't allow itself the luxury of observing every detail. It collects fragments, loose clues, general sensations. And then, behind the scenes, it tries to organize all of this into something coherent. It is at this point that the present can be reinterpreted as memory. Not because it was lived before, but because it was lived too superficially to be marked as new. Attention functions as a temporal marker. When something receives full attention, the brain understands, this is now. It creates clear outlines, differentiating the moment from what came before. But when attention fails, the brain loses this marker. The event happens, but without sufficient depth to be fixed as a new experience. Later, sometimes seconds later, the brain revisits that incomplete record and treats it as something already known. This explains why these strange sensations often arise in mundane moments. A familiar route, a trivial conversation, a neutral environment. Situations where the mind is present just enough to function, but too absent to register. The body is there, the eyes are open, but consciousness is elsewhere. Thinking about what needs to be done next, what happened before, loose worries. The present moment passes unnoticed. And the brain hates gaps. It needs continuity to maintain a stable internal narrative. So it fills them in. It uses old memories, familiar patterns, similar experiences. It pastes these references onto the recent event and concludes, this was already here. The feeling that arises is one of recognition, not novelty. And since this conclusion happens outside of consciousness, it comes disguised as certainty. This mechanism intensifies in states of mild anxiety, that constant background anxiety that many people carry without realizing it. Anxiety shifts attention to the future. The brain becomes busy simulating scenarios, anticipating problems, rehearsing responses. The present becomes a backdrop. And everything that happens in this background risks being poorly registered. Then, when the brain tries to understand what happened, it accesses the wrong file. Autopilot is another classic scenario. When we repeat routines, the brain further reduces attentional investment. It relies on established patterns. Driving, walking, working, talking, everything can happen with minimal conscious supervision. This is functional, but it comes at a price. The present moment loses its uniqueness. And without uniqueness, it resembles memory. This process reveals something profound about the modern mindset. We live accelerated, overloaded, always divided between stimuli. Attention has become a rare resource. And when it is fragmented, the experience of time is also fragmented. The present ceases to be lived as presence and begins to be processed as raw data, something to be organized later. But this later is already contaminated by old memories. There's a hidden truth here that often goes unnoticed. Many strange mental experiences aren't a sign of excessive awareness, but of a lack of it. They don't happen because we're too attentive, but because we're not attentive enough. The brain does the best it can with the little it receives. And sometimes this results in subtle, yet impactful distortions. This also helps to understand why these phenomena tend to increase during life's transitional phases. Changes, pressures, personal transformations. Moments when the mind is busy reorganizing decisions, reviewing paths, recalculating internal routes. Attention spreads. The present becomes just another item in line. And the brain, trying to cope with everything, begins to recycle experiences. This recycling isn't random. It follows emotional criteria. The brain seeks references that bring a sense of stability. Something familiar, even if it's not exact. This creates a false familiarity that can be comforting or unsettling, depending on the context. In both cases, the psychological impact is real. Realizing this changes how we look at these sensations. They cease to be a supernatural mystery and become signs of how we are living. Signs of scattered attention, reduced presence, a mental journey always in transit. The brain is not failing. It is adapting to an environment that demands too much and offers little space for pause. This is what we explore here on Dark Human Science. Not just the strange phenomena themselves, but the behind-the-scenes workings that reveal how the human mind constructs reality when no one is looking. How it edits time, rearranges experience, and creates meaning even when attention fails. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding the role of attention not only explains why the present becomes memory, but also how we can alter this process. How small changes in our way of being can completely transform our perception of the present moment. But before moving forward on this path, it's worth noting something simple. How many moments of your day pass without truly affecting you? Perhaps this question will resonate as we move forward, because it opens up space for greater reflection on presence, choices, and impact. On how living less on autopilot changes not only memory, but the very experience of existence. If this resonated with you, leave a comment below. I'm on this journey too. There is a specific moment when all of this fits together in an almost uncomfortably way, When we realize that the brain is not interested in showing reality as it is, but in save energy while maintaining a sense of continuity. This is where mental shortcuts come in. They are not the exception. They are the rule. The brain functions based on them because the cost of analyzing everything from scratch all the time would be unsustainable. Every new situation you experience doesn't start from scratch in your mind. It's immediately compared to a vast bank of past experiences. The brain silently asks, what does this resemble? And this question doesn't seek absolute precision. It seeks speed sufficient to allow for a functional response. When it finds something even minimally similar, it doesn't investigate further. It decides. This is the shortcut. A ready-made model being reused. An old structure being applied to a new context. And most of the time it works well. You recognize social patterns, understand environments, react to facial expressions, interpret tones of voice. All this happens without conscious effort because the brain has already traveled these paths before. It doesn't need to reinvent the wheel. The problem arises when the similarity is too superficial, but still sufficient to trigger the model. At that moment, the brain attaches an invisible label to the current event, memory. Not because it happened before but because it looks with something that happened. The subjective result is strange. You are living in the moment, but it already reaches consciousness with the feeling of the past. This label doesn't say, this is identical. It says, this is familiar. And the brain doesn't differentiate well between these two things when it's operating in economy mode. Familiarity becomes synonymous with recognition. Recognition becomes a feeling of remembrance. And remembrance gives the impression that time has become scrambled. This mechanism explains why the phenomenon is so convincing. It doesn't seem like a gross error. It seems subtle, almost elegant. Because the brain doesn't create a false memory out of thin air. It reuses real structures, real emotions, real contexts, only out of order. It takes an old mold and fits it into the present before you have time to notice. This strategy has a direct impact on how we go through life. Because mental shortcuts don't just shape memory. They shape decisions, judgments, beliefs, and even how we interpret who we are. When the brain decides too quickly that something is already known, it reduces curiosity. It diminishes attention. It closes off possibilities. How many times have you entered a new situation with the feeling that you already knew how it would end? How many times have you failed to observe carefully because everything seems so familiar? In many cases, it wasn't real experience. It was a shortcut. An old model being applied to a reality that hadn't yet been fully lived. There's a hidden truth in all of this. Mental shortcuts are efficient but conservative. They keep the mind in familiar territory. They protect against the unknown, but they also limit transformation. When the present is constantly labeled as the past, the chance of something truly new emerging diminishes. The journey becomes predictable even as the world changes. This process is almost invisible because it doesn't interrupt the flow of experience. On the contrary, it smooths it. It eliminates noise, doubts, pauses. And we confuse this fluidity with clarity. We confuse speed with understanding. We confuse familiarity with truth. The brain doesn't do this out of malice. It does it because it was shaped for survival, not contemplation. It prefers to make comfortable mistakes rather than succeed through effort. And in a modern environment where stimuli never stop arriving, this strategy intensifies. The more overloaded the mind, the more it depends on ready-made models. This creates a curious situation. We live in constant external transformation, but with rigid internal structures. The world changes, but the brain insists on interpreting everything with the same filters. When something escapes these filters, a strange feeling arises. Discomfort. The moment when the present seems displaced in time. And that's precisely where many people begin to question their own perception. They think they're imagining things, that they're exaggerating. When, in reality, they're simply perceiving an internal mechanism working without disguise. The mental shortcut became visible. The memory label was applied too early. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding mental shortcuts isn't just about explaining strange phenomena. It's about revealing how much of our daily experience is constructed. It's about showing how we react more than we choose. How we repeat more than we perceive. How the mind, trying to spare us, ends up trapping us. When the brain attaches this memory label to the present, it doesn't just distort time. It distorts meaning. It makes the now seem less important, less alive, less worthy of attention. And this has an emotional impact. Moments that could be significant go unnoticed. Experiences that could generate learning become repetition. This mechanism also explains why so many people feel that life passes by too quickly. Not because time speeds up, but because many moments are not fully registered as new. They slip straight into the file of known things. Without attention, without depth, without presence. When we begin to see this, something changes in our mindset. We start to distrust automatic certainties a little more. To question immediate sensations. To realize that the brain is often trying to make things too easy. And that this ease comes at an invisible price. This price manifests itself in the form of repeated decisions, recurring emotional patterns, and self-recycled internal narratives. The present becomes merely a trigger for old memories, instead of a real space for choice. And this shapes the entire personal journey, often without us even realizing it. But this realization doesn't have to be paralyzing. On the contrary, it opens a window. A space for observation. A point where the automatic can be interrupted, even if only for seconds. And those seconds make a difference. Because when the brain stops cutting for a moment, the present regains texture. It seems like now again. And that feeling changes everything: decisions, emotions, impact. This understanding sets the stage for something even deeper, something that involves not only how the brain conserves energy, but how it constructs its own sense of identity over time. And it is precisely at this point that the conversation begins to take on a different dimension. If this resonated with you, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. There is one essential detail that makes this experience so intense and at the same time so difficult to ignore. She doesn't come weak. It doesn't arise as a passing doubt or a vague impression. It comes laden with conviction. A silent, profound, almost intimate conviction. And that's precisely what makes this feeling seem too real to be dismissed as imagination. When the brain registers the present as if it were the past, it activates not only cognitive areas of recognition, but also regions linked to emotional memory. This changes everything. Because emotion is what gives weight to experience. It's what makes something seem real, important, meaningful. Without emotion, a memory is just information. With emotion, it becomes certainty. The emotional brain doesn't work with refined temporal logic. It works with relevance, with impact, with bodily sensation. When this region kicks in, the body reacts as if it were accessing something experienced. The emotional tone is already there. The familiarity is already there. And for the conscious mind, this is interpreted as proof. That's why when that feeling arises, you don't think, "I think this has already happened." You feel, "This has already happened." There's a huge difference between thinking and feeling. Feeling comes first, faster, stronger. Rational thought arrives later, trying to explain something that has already been decided on another level. This emotional activation creates an experience that is almost impossible to deny internally. Even when you know rationally that the situation is new, the body disagrees. The body reacts as if it recognizes it. And we have been trained throughout our lives to trust the body. To trust emotions as signals of truth. There is a hidden truth in all of this. Emotional certainty is not synonymous with factual truth. But the brain treats it as if it were. Because, evolutionarily, emotion has always been a powerful shortcut to survival. What seemed familiar was usually safe. What seemed strange was usually risky. This code still runs in the background. So, when the present activates an old emotional circuit, it automatically inherits the weight of that memory, even if the context is different. Emotion doesn't ask about dates. It doesn't check chronology. It simply signals, "This matters," or "This is already known." And that signal is strong enough to shape the entire experience. That's why this feeling doesn't easily dissipate. You can try to rationalize it, distract yourself, move on. But something keeps echoing. A kind of emotional residue. A slight discomfort. A persistent curiosity. Because the emotional brain hasn't been fixed. It continues to operate with the same interpretation. This mechanism also explains why different people react differently to the same phenomenon. Some find it fascinating. Others find it unsettling. Others simply ignore it. It all depends on the emotional charge that accompanies the sensation. When it is neutral, it passes quickly. When it is intense, it leaves a mark. And this intensity usually arises when the brain associates the present moment with memories full of meaning. It doesn't have to be a specific event consciously remembered. A similar emotional atmosphere is enough. A tone of voice, lighting, body posture. Small details that act as keys to old files. The brain doesn't differentiate well between the origin of an emotion and its activation. Whether the emotion was triggered now or comes from the past is of little importance. What matters is that it's active. And an active emotion tends to be interpreted as evidence. This creates the illusion of solidity. The feeling that it can't be wrong. This is one of the reasons why this phenomenon so deeply affects our mindset. It challenges the idea that we are reliable observers of our own experience. It shows that conviction does not guarantee accuracy, that feeling is not the same as knowing, and that often our firmest decisions stem from invisible processes. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding why this feeling seems so real leads us to even more delicate territory: the relationship between identity and memory. What we feel as I is, to a large extent, constructed upon remembered emotions. When the present activates these emotions, it directly touches upon the feeling of identity. Therefore, it doesn't just seem like a perceptual error. It seems like something personal. It seems like something that relates to who you are, what you've already experienced, your own history. The brain isn't just saying, "This is familiar." It's saying, "This is part of you." And that has a profound impact. This impact manifests itself in seemingly intuitive decisions, in quick judgments, in certainties that are difficult to explain. How many times have you felt that something wasn't for you, or that it suited you, without a clear reason? Many of these impressions arise precisely from this intersection between old emotion and current stimulus. When emotional memory comes into play, the present ceases to be neutral. It gains direction. It pushes toward a specific reaction. It draws closer or pushes away. It calms or creates tension. And all this happens before conscious reflection. Reason arrives later, trying to justify a choice that has already been made at the emotional level. This doesn't mean we're condemned to live deceived. It means we need to recognize the weight of these internal layers. The brain doesn't lie deliberately. It interprets based on what it has. And sometimes, what it has is old emotion being activated out of context. Realizing this changes how we deal with these feelings. Instead of blindly accepting them or dismissing them as nonsense, we can observe them. Question where they come from. Ask if that certainty belongs to the present moment or to another moment that is being reactivated. This observation does not negate the experience. On the contrary, it deepens it. It transforms strangeness into curiosity, discomfort into investigation, sensation into a clue. And this opens up space for more conscious, less automatic choices. Because ultimately, understanding why this feeling seems so real is understanding how the brain constructs reality from emotion. How it uses the past to give meaning to the present. And how, sometimes, this construction is so convincing that it imposes itself as truth. This understanding sets the stage for something even more delicate, something that involves not only memory and emotion, but the boundary between perception and conviction. A boundary where many important decisions are made without us realizing it. And it is precisely there that this conversation begins to take on a different weight. If all of this resonated with you, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. After understanding why this feeling seems so real, a silent question almost inevitably arises, one that many people avoid asking aloud. Is this normal, or is it a sign that something is wrong with me? This doubt appears because, when the experience is intense, it directly affects our inner confidence. And when confidence wavers, the mind seeks quick, often frightening explanations. So it's worth making something very clear from the start, calmly and without artificial mystery. In the vast majority of cases, this is normal. More common than you might think. More human than it seems. It's not a sign of loss of control, it's not a sign of a serious failure, it's not a sign of something supernatural or dangerous. It's a byproduct of a brain that works fast, anticipates too much, and lives under constant pressure. The human brain wasn't designed for a world of continuous stimuli, information overload, uninterrupted decisions, and fragmented attention all day long. Even so, it tries to cope. And when it tries to cope with everything at once, it simplifies processes. It cuts corners. It reuses records. This kind of sensation arises precisely there, at this point of adaptation. Under normal conditions, these episodes are sporadic, brief, and do not interfere with daily life. They appear, cause strangeness, and disappear. They leave no lasting effects. They do not alter the perception of reality in a lasting way. They are like small temporary slippages within a system that soon reorganizes itself. The problem begins when this feeling becomes too frequent. Not because it, in itself, is dangerous, but because the frequency usually indicates something else happening behind the scenes in the mind. And here it's important not to fall into extremes. It's not a reason to panic, but it's also not something to ignore completely. When these episodes repeat themselves very regularly, they are usually linked to prolonged states of stress, sleep deprivation, mental or emotional overload. Situations in which the brain spends long periods operating in emergency mode, always anticipating, always solving, always playing catch-up. Under these conditions, the line between the present, memory, and prediction becomes even more blurred. Sleep, for example, plays a crucial role in this process. It is during deep rest that the brain reorganizes memories, clears excesses, and adjusts connections. When sleep is insufficient or fragmented, this work remains incomplete. The result is a brain trying to function with poorly organized files. And poorly organized files increase the chance of out-of-order records. Constant stress also alters how the brain prioritizes information. It begins to focus on what is urgent, what seems like a threat, what demands a quick response. The present becomes just another piece of data amidst the chaos. And the less mindfulness there is, the greater the chance that the present moment will be registered incompletely and reinterpreted later as something already known. Mental overload has a similar effect. Too many decisions, too many worries, too many tasks open at the same time. The brain goes into containment mode. It tries to save energy in everything it can. And the perception of time is one of the first things to be optimized. The present moment loses sharpness. Experience loses depth. And the strange begins to seem familiar. All of this doesn't mean that something is broken. It means that the system is operating at its limit. It's like a computer running with little available memory. It keeps running, but it starts reusing processes, closing shortcuts, and reusing data. The behavior changes not because the system has failed, but because it is overloaded. There is a hidden truth here that often puts a lot of people at ease. Feeling this way doesn't mean losing touch with reality. On the contrary. It often means that the brain is trying to maintain that connection at all costs, even with limited resources. It prefers to create continuity rather than let the experience become completely fragmented. This understanding changes the tone of the initial question. Instead of, is this normal or wrong? The question becomes, what is my brain trying to compensate for? Because most of the time, these sensations are indirect signs of how we are living, thinking, resting, and coping with our own journey. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there is an important difference between an isolated phenomenon and a recurring pattern. Understanding this difference helps to separate healthy curiosity from legitimate warning signs, without falling into alarmism or negligence. And this distinction involves something we rarely pay attention to, the emotional and mental context in which these experiences arise. When the brain is balanced, these sensations tend to be rare and brief. When the brain is constantly stressed, they find fertile ground to repeat themselves. Not because something new is emerging, but because the same mechanism is being triggered repeatedly. And here's a delicate point. The more frightened a person is by the experience, the more attention they pay to it. And the more attention, the more the brain registers. This can create a cycle of hyperobservation, where any small sensation becomes a cause for concern. Therefore, tranquility is a fundamental part of understanding. Observe without judging. Acknowledge without dramatizing. Understand without labeling. This attitude makes a difference because it gives the mind back some of the space it has lost. It reduces pressure. It lessens the need for shortcuts. And, little by little, the present is once again experienced as a gift, not as something recycled. This perspective also helps to understand why so many people go through this at specific stages of life. Major changes, important decisions, professional or personal transitions. Moments of transformation require a lot of internal processing. The brain is reorganizing maps, identities, expectations. And, in this process, small distortions are almost inevitable. None of this invalidates the experience. On the contrary, it becomes a sensitive indicator of how the mind is dealing with the world. A subtle sign, not of failure, but of adaptation under pressure. And there's an even deeper layer to this conversation, a layer that connects these phenomena to how we construct the feeling of continuity of the self, over time. Because, in the end, we're not just talking about memory or perception. We're talking about identity, about internal coherence, about how the brain weaves the narrative of its own existence. But before venturing into that territory, it's worth letting this part settle. Understanding that, for most people, this experience is just another reflection of the complexity of the human mind, operating at the limit of an overly demanding world. If this explanation brought clarity to your life, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. Perhaps the strangest thing is not that the brain confuses the present with the past, but the fact that it rarely experiences the present as it truly is. This idea seems simple at first glance, almost too philosophical. But when we look closely at everything that has been said so far, it ceases to be abstract and begins to sound almost inevitable. The brain wasn't made to remain in the present. It was shaped for survival. To anticipate risks, calculate possibilities, review past experiences, and prepare future responses. The present, for it, is merely a point of passage. A narrow corridor between what has already happened and what may yet happen. And the more complex the environment, the less time it spends in that corridor. Much of our conscious experience happens a few steps behind or a few steps ahead of the present moment. We are remembering, comparing, evaluating, projecting. The pure, raw present, without interpretation, is almost never accessed. It is quickly covered by layers of meaning, expectation, and memory. And that is precisely why, sometimes, it seems displaced in time. When the brain registers the present as the past, it is merely revealing something that is normally hidden, our structural difficulty in being here. Not here in the body but here in the experience. The mind rarely allows itself to live a moment without immediately transforming it into something else. A lesson, an alert, a pattern, a repetition. This realization may sound uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. Because it takes the weight off the "something is wrong with me" and puts it in its rightful place. The natural functioning of a system that prioritizes continuity over presence. The brain wants the story to make sense. It wants coherence. It wants a stable narrative. And to achieve this, it sacrifices the present moment without hesitation. There is a hidden truth in this process that is rarely confronted. Many of our feelings of strangeness do not come from something unusual, but from the momentary clash between presence and automatism. When, for some reason, the brain fails to transform the present into the past quickly enough, the fissure appears. The discomfort. The strange sensation. It's as if, for an instant, the mechanism becomes visible. And when that happens, we realize how much we've lived on autopilot up until then. How many moments passed without being truly lived? How many decisions were made based on old models? How many reactions were just well-disguised repetitions? This realization isn't pleasant, but it's powerful. It opens up space for transformation. Because if the brain rarely lives in the present, then living in the present becomes an almost radical act. A gesture against the current. Something that requires conscious effort, intention, a pause. It's not natural. It's not automatic. It's a choice. And conscious choices always carry an impact. This reflection changes the mindset. Instead of trying to eliminate these strange sensations, we begin to see them as signs. Not of failure but of excess. Of speed. Of overload. They become clues about how we are navigating our own journey, not just isolated curiosities of the mind. The brain confusing the present with the past is merely a visible symptom of something larger. The difficulty of sustaining attention, presence, and depth in a world that demands immediate responses all the time. The faster we live, the less the present moment takes root. It slips away. And what slips away ends up being treated as something already seen. There is also a profound emotional impact to this. When the present is not fully lived, it leaves no clear marks. And what leaves no marks tends to be forgotten or confused. This contributes to that diffuse feeling that time passes too quickly, that the days blend together, that everything seems repetitive. Not because nothing happens but because little is truly registered as new. This perception changes how we view memory, identity, and even purpose. Because if most of the time we are operating in predictive mode, reacting to old patterns, then much of our personal history is built more by repetition than by choice. And this raises uncomfortable but necessary questions. How many of your decisions are automatic responses to past experiences? How many emotions are reactivations of old memories, and not reactions to the present? How many certainties are merely emotional shortcuts that seem true because they sound familiar? These questions don't have simple answers, but they carry enormous transformative power. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding that the brain rarely lives in the present opens the way to something even more relevant. The possibility of interrupting, even briefly, this automatic cycle. Not to fix the brain but to engage in dialogue with it. To create small moments of presence within a system that prefers to run. These openings don't arise from major external changes. They arise from internal micro-adjustments. From moments of intentional attention. From real pauses. From observation without judgment. They are instants when the brain can't cut corners so quickly, can't immediately attach the memory label. And in those instants, the present moment appears. It's not an idealized, perfect, enlightened present. It's a simple, raw, sometimes even uncomfortable present. But it's real. And this reality has texture. It has its own time. It has impact. It leaves marks that are not confused with the past or with predictions. It exists. When the brain confuses the present with the past, it paradoxically reminds us of the importance of the present. It exposes how far we are from it. And this exposure, however strange, can be the beginning of a silent change in the way we live. This is not a closed conclusion. It's an opening. An invitation to continued observation. Because, from here, the conversation begins to touch on something even deeper. How consciousness can interfere in this process and what the real consequences of this are for how we construct our internal history. And before moving forward on this path, it's worth noting this idea, almost as a personal milestone. Realizing that the brain rarely lives in the present moment is not a problem to be eliminated, but a phenomenon to be understood. If this reflection has stayed with you this far, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, it might not be by chance. Perhaps some part of this conversation has resonated with you in a silent way, a way that doesn't demand an immediate response but keeps echoing. And if this message touched you at some point in your own journey, it makes sense to continue walking this path. Subscribing to the channel is simply a way of saying, this helps me think better, see beyond the obvious, and question what I feel to be true. If you'd like, leave a comment saying you stayed until the end. It can be something simple like, this message was for me, or, I'm with you until the end, not to mark our presence, but to record that this reflection found space within you. Sometimes, writing a sentence is the most honest way to acknowledge what we've just felt. And if, at any point in this video you noticed a real connection, that feeling of, this makes sense, a like helps keep this type of content alive. Not as an automatic gesture, but as a sign that this conversation was worth the time, attention, and silence shared here. Now, before you leave, there's a video here that complements this very topic. It delves into another layer of this same mystery from a different angle. Click and continue the conversation with me there. The conversation doesn't end here, it just changes perspective. Perhaps the initial hook is still spinning inside you. That simple yet unsettling question. Because ultimately, understanding why the brain confuses time is also a way of understanding why we live so little in the present moment, and what happens when we begin to realize this. This is dark human science, where perception is not reality,